Shutter speed. One of the most important camera settings that determines how your images and videos look. Whether you're freezing action, creating silky motion blur, or capturing light trails, knowing how to control shutter speed is essential to becoming a better photographer and filmmaker. In this video, I'll break down everything you need to know about shutter speed, how it works, when to use fast or slow speeds, how it affects exposure, and how to avoid common mistakes. Plus, I'll share some pro tips and creative tricks along the way. Let's get started. Section 1. What is shutter speed? Shutter speed refers to how long your camera's sensor is exposed to light when you take a photo. It measures in fractions of a second, like 1/4000th of a second or 1/250th of a second, or even a full 30-second exposure. A faster shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, captures an image almost instantly, freezing action, while a slower shutter speed, like 1 second, allows more light in and can blur motion. How shutter speed affects exposure. Shutter speed is one part of the exposure triangle, working together with aperture and ISO. A faster shutter speed means less light hits the sensor, so you may need a wider aperture, lower f-stop, or higher ISO to compensate. A slower shutter lets in more light, which can be helpful in low-light photography. Section 2. How shutter speed affects motion. Now, let's talk about how shutter speed affects motion in your shots. This is where things get really interesting. Fast shutter speeds and freezing motion. 1/4000 to 1/8000 of a second. Perfect for ultra-fast action like birds, sports, or freezing water splashes. 1/1000th of a second to 1/2000th of a second. Great for moving cars, people running, or wildlife. 1/250th of a second to 1/500th of a second. Ideal for portraits, street photography, and general movement. Anything faster than 1/1000th of a second is great for freezing action. Perfect for sports, wildlife, and even handheld shots in bright daylight. Slow shutter speeds, creating motion blur. 1/60th of a second to 1/250th of a second. Works well for handheld shots, but can introduce some motion blur. 1/30th of a second to 1 second, ideal for motion blur effects in waterfalls, panning shots, and low-light photography. 1 second to 30 seconds, used for night photography, light trails, and long exposures. If your shutter is slower than 1/60th of a second, any handheld movement can create blur, so you'll need image stabilization or a tripod. Section 3. Shutter speed for video. Shooting video. Shutter speed plays a different role. Video follows the 180-degree shutter rule. Your shutter speed should be double your frame rate for natural motion blur. For example, at 24 frames per second, use 1/50th of a second. At 60 frames per second, use 1/125th of a second. If your shutter speed is too high, your footage will look unnatural and jittery, almost like a soap opera effect. If it's too low, motion will be too blurry. Section 4. Common shutter speed mistakes and how to fix them. Shooting too slow without stabilization. The solution? Use a tripod or image stabilization. 2. Not adjusting ISO or aperture. The solution? Increase ISO or open up the aperture when using fast shutter speeds. 3. Using incorrect shutter speed for video. The solution? Follow the 180-degree rule for smooth motion. 4. Not using an ND filter in bright conditions. Solution: if shooting long exposures or video outdoors, ND filters help control brightness. Section 5. Creative uses of shutter speed. Light trails at night. 10 to 30 second exposure. Use a tripod and shoot in manual mode. Cars create stunning streaks of light. Silky waterfalls. 1 to 5 second exposures. Lower ISO, use an ND filter, and stabilize your shot. Shutter speed is one of the most powerful creative tools in photography. Whether you're freezing time or creating artistic blur, mastering these settings will take your skills to the next level. If this video helped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more camera tips.